Welcome to the Sherdog Radio Network preview for UFC Fight Night 245, Hernandez versus Pineda, also known as UFC Vegas 99. I'm your host, Ben Duffy of Sherdog.com. With me this evening, stepping in for Keith Shillan, who is indisposed, is Mr. Dayne Fox, the newest member of our radio and podcast team here. Dayne, how are you doing today?
Doing very well. Happy to be here. I do apologize for the visual. I know that replacing Keith, it looks like he might have gotten smacked in the face with a shovel or something like that if I'm stepping in, but yeah.
Don't apologize for not looking like Keith. Like it's
I will give kudos. The last time I stepped on for the After the Bell show, somebody was saying that I looked like Amish Roadkill from ECW. I don't know who that was, but that's a compliment to me. I thought that was fantastic. So thank you much on that one.
That's a really good call, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, it'd be great if we could get you in one of the little Amish hats. But yeah, I like this. I think you should steer into that and kind of make it your gimmick. Speaking of gimmicks, the UFC is back at the Apex for number 99, and that's not counting whatever events there may be more than 99. At any rate, 99, we're going on 100 now. We are several years removed from the relaxing of COVID era restrictions. So what was once an expedient for the UFC is just now the new normal. They owe ESPN, 26 or 28 cards a year, and this is the cheapest way to get them to them. The card itself, 11 fights, headlined by a middleweight contenders matchup between Hernandez and Pineda. Give me your general temperature on this card. I mean, not comparing it to an $80 pay-per-view, obviously, but comparing it to the usual weekly fight night fare. Give this one a letter grade on paper. How excited are you for it? How good is this card?
I would say it's in the neighborhood of a C plus, B minus, which is a little bit higher than what I expected when I walked in. Largely because, I sat down, looked at the card, and I'm like, oh, that actually looks like a fun fight. That one looks like a fun fight. That one looks like a fun fight. But I will admit that this is one of those cards where they started throwing fights on there, hoping that they could get something that was a legit main event. And when they couldn't, they're just like, this one looks like the best one, so we'll promote that to being a 5-rounder. I wish that wasn't the case as often as it is, but if we're being honest, that's kind of standard practice at this point. So to say that it's roughly average, like I said, C plus, is about par for the course.
I'd agree with that. I'd give it maybe a C plus. And honestly, in my case at least, most of the merit is due to the main event. Like they're not the highest ranked middleweights. Obviously, they're just kind of skirting the outskirts of Sherdog's top 15. Without looking at the UFC's rankings, I'm going to guess that while one or both of these guys might be ranked, neither one of them is going to be in the top 6 or 7. But I just love it as a fight. Like, I enjoy both of these fighters a lot. I think Hernandez is one of the more underrated fighters in the UFC right now, and Pereira has just been such a pleasant surprise ever since he's joined, that I love this fight, even if it isn't a possible title eliminator like we had last week. But south of that main event, there's some pretty rough sledding here, man. Like nothing against her, because her late career resurgence has been a fun story, but 41-year-old Jessica Penne on I figured she was retired. The UFC trying its damnedest to get Robelis Despaigne a knockout in the curtain jerker. Like, it's, I think, pretty slim pickings outside of the main event. But if you feel differently, if there are any of these main card or prelim fights that you're really stoked for, let me know.
There's a pair of flyweight contests that I think would be a lot of fun. Charles Johnson has, I don't know exactly how to put it, because it's not quite a revitalization, but he's picked up steam. He's turned himself around from his early start where we all thought he was about to be cut, and he's been a lot of fun to watch. And they're pairing him with Mudaerji, who, when he decides to show up, which at this rate is once a year, he's a lot of fun to watch. And I know that Matheus Nicolau fights can be a pretty boring affair, but I think Asu Almabaev has the style to potentially drag out something fun out of him. And then the co-main event, Rob Font has lost some of his steam. He's been losing far more than winning as of late, but I think him and Kyler Phillips could be a lot of fun to watch too.
Yeah, can't disagree with any of those. And we will certainly get to each of those fights, in their order. Any other general thoughts on this card before we dive into these prelims?
I think you pretty much nailed it with what you said. There's some rough sledding on here, but the UFC has us. We're going to watch it anyway, so let's get into it.
All right. First up on the UFC Vegas 99 undercard is the lone heavyweight bout on the card, unless Jake Hadley really, really screws the pooch on Friday. It is Austen Lane versus Robelis Despaigne. Lane, the 36-year-old Floridian, is 12-5 with 1 no contest overall. He is 0-2 with 1 no contest since joining the UFC as a 2-time veteran of Dana White's Contender Series. He fought all the way back on season 2, getting lamped by Greg Hardy, went and won a number of fights in some regional promotions, including Fury Fighting Championship right down here in Texas. He reappeared on the 6th season back in 2022, knocked out Richard Jacoby. That paved his way to the UFC, where, as I said, he's 0-2 with 1 no contest thus far, and his 2 losses have both been knockouts. He will look to break that streak, hopefully, against Despaigne. Despaigne, 36-year-old Cuban, is 5-1 overall. He is 1-1 since joining the UFC, also out of Fury Fighting Championship. He won his UFC debut, taking just 18 seconds to knock out Josh Parisian before running into Waldo Cortez Acosta back in May at UFC on ESPN, Lewis versus Nascimento. There, we first learned about the possible limitations of the karate Olympian, as Cortez Acosta grounded him with ease and won a straightforward, if miserable to watch, unanimous decision. So Despaigne looking to prove that he is not just a one-dimensional striker, that he can be an actual contender at heavyweight. He is heavily favored to do so, to say the least. Despaigne out there at -450, Lane +350 coming back. I remember when Keith and I previewed the Despaigne versus Cortez Acosta fight, and I remember Keith saying Cortez Acosta could take this guy down probably if he wanted to. He's a huge heavyweight who's pretty nimble on his feet, and that might be his best route to victory. And I agreed, even though I didn't think there was any way that Cortez Acosta was going to do it. I figured Cortez Acosta was tailor-made for Despaigne to pick up another highlight reel knockout on, just considering that Cortez Acosta is a boxer who doesn't have a ton of power, relies heavily on his jab, and I thought Despaigne would just literally head kick him unconscious inside of 2 minutes. Instead, Cortez Acosta decided to start taking the man down, and the sound we all heard was just the air being let out of the arena like a slashed tire, as it was horrible to watch, and it changed the whole narrative on Despaigne. What we had before that was a 6'7", 265-pound Taekwondo Olympian who had knocked out all of his previous MMA opponents in like 6 minutes of total cage time. And 4.5 of that was his first fight. And now it's, well, does he even have enough time at age 36 or 37 to overcome that glaring weakness? I don't know if the UFC wants us to find out whether he can overcome that glaring weakness just yet, because they've matched him against another fighter that on paper should be a really, really favorable style matchup for Despaigne. Lane, he's 36 years old, and while he is another example of the mythical A-level athlete crossing over to MMA, I mean, he was a college football star. He was drafted by the Jags, even if I don't think he ever suited up. But
he did. He played for him for 3 years.
Okay, there you go. If your Wikipedia article has your NFL Combine numbers, on some level, you are a very good athlete. And even at 36, Austen Lane probably is. But the things that make great defensive ends in the NFL don't necessarily make great fighters. Like, I'm sure Lane could still rock the 40-yard dash or the 20-yard shuttle drill, but that's, as an MMA fighter, he's a long, lanky heavyweight. I mean, he looks more like a basketball small forward now than, you know, an NFL defensive end, having dropped maybe 30 pounds of muscle. But, you know, big, long, wide frame. He's got that kind of like Johnny Walker type frame. He has a ton of power, just power that comes from being a big heavyweight and kind of the leverage and mechanical advantages that just come from having long limbs. But he's never gotten over his defensive lapses. Like, he's a terrible striker defensively. We don't know. His gas tank is suspect because the times that he's been past the first round, he has generally been much the worse for wear, even in fights he's been winning. Like, yeah, Lane is a guy that should hang around the bottom reaches of the UFC heavyweight division for a while, and all of his fights should be knockouts, either for or against, within the first 7 minutes. I don't know if Lane can take Despaigne down, but if he doesn't try, I think he's toast really, really fast. You know, Despaigne is as big as Lane is. Despaigne is much larger. He's absolutely titanic, and he is an athlete of the kind that really does carry over to combat sports. I mean, the guy can cross the cage with one step and be delivering a head kick or just, you know, a crushing, you know, counter right as he arrives. I think Despaigne's still going to be a really hard guy to beat in the UFC heavyweight division in a straight up striking match. If Lane obliges him with that, I got Despaigne by first round knockout. If Lane decides to try to take Despaigne down, I still have Despaigne by first round knockout, because I just don't think Lane can necessarily follow the route to victory that Waldo Cortez Acosta did. Like, again, Cortez Acosta he's another huge guy. I think he's bulkier and stronger than Lane at this point. And despite Lane being the ex-NFL player, Cortez Acosta is the guy who's more of a plus athlete by MMA standards, just nimble, coordinated, light on his feet for such a huge guy. He was able to take Despaigne down with ease. I don't know if Lane can do that. I think even if Lane wants to try taking Despaigne down, he's going to have a tough time getting inside on him. I think he's going to run into knees, uppercuts. He may just be slow enough getting in that Despaigne can actually get his hips out away from him and shuck him off and stay on his feet. I am not a believer in Despaigne as a future contender. He'll be a really, really fun novelty, I think, at best, but I think he's got enough to get past Lane here. Give me Despaigne by first round knockout.
Well, yeah, I agree with you. Let's just wrap it up on this one. No, there's really not much I could add. You pretty much covered all the bases that I can think of. Lane, I do believe that he will be attempting to take Despaigne to the ground, because that's what he attempted to do with Yanada Deniz in his last fight. He tried very hard to take him down. He tried 3 or 4 times, got him down and held him down for a good while, but once the fight was back on the feet, Deniz was able to dispose of him pretty easily, if we're being honest. Which is kind of a bummer. I can kind of see what the UFC sees in Lane. You know, like you said, he's by UFC heavyweight standards, he's a phenomenal athlete. He's got some good natural power. I just feel like the time in the NFL didn't serve him well in terms of his MMA career. He, you know, as a defensive end, you're learning to burst forward. And he's got the type of long, lanky frame that he would be better off being an outfighter and picking his opponents apart. And so he's kind of had to fight against type with regards to that. And it shows, because I believe every single one of his losses has come by knockout. He gets chinned nonstop. And so, like you said, I think the UFC wants to see Despaigne succeed here. He's got that highlight reel knockout that got him signed to the UFC. I can't remember who it was against, but But yeah, we all remember that one. It was phenomenal, and the UFC scooped him up before anybody else could because somebody was going to. I feel like Despaigne's he's the picture perfect example of why the UFC needs to implement some sort of a farm system.
If the UFC hadn't snapped him up, he'd be the one fighting Francis Ngannou in PFL this coming weekend.
Yep, exactly. And I know that a lot of people will say that, well, the LFA is a farm system. I'm like, yes, I get that. But if they're in the LFA, they still have options to go elsewhere. If the UFC had some sort of developmental contract, I know that they did that with Greg Hardy, but that's not a real developmental deal. That's not a real farm system. Despaigne would be perfect for that. But as it is, he can still get wins provided they give him favorable matchups. And this is exactly what that is. I'm 100% with you. I think that he gets laid out of there in the first round.
From the biggest fighters on the card to some of the smallest, next up at UFC Fight Night 245 is a strawweight matchup between Melissa Martinez and Alice Ardelean. Martinez, the 27-year-old Mexican, is 7-1 overall. She's 0-1 since joining the UFC as the former and inaugural Combate Global strawweight champ. She made her UFC debut a little over 2 years ago at UFC 279. You remember the card that Khamzat Chimaev blew up by blowing weight by 10 pounds. Anyway, lost in all the detritus of that main card was her dropping a unanimous decision to Elise Reed on the undercard. It is almost, or it's a little over 2 full years later. She is back, and waiting for her is a woman who the last time Martinez fought was mostly infamous as a gym homewrecker, apparently. Alice Ardelean, 32-year-old Romanian, 9-6 overall. She is also 0-1 in the UFC. She made her debut back in July at UFC 304, dropping a split decision to Shauna Bannon. So 2 women still looking for their first UFC win. Martinez is slightly favored to get it. She is -150. Ardelean is +130. I remember Melissa Martinez, she fought for the inaugural Combate, it was Combate Americas at the time, strawweight title at the Tito versus Alberto card back in December of 2019. I actually went and covered that one in person. Texas is a big place. Driving from Houston to the Rio Grande Valley, I mean, that's a drive. It was like a 6.5 hour drive. And I remember being more excited for that fight, the Des Yanez versus Melly Martinez fight, than really anything else on the card, not only because, hey, it's another promotion installing a strawweight division, but I thought they were 2 of the more promising prospects in the organization. And Melissa Martinez in particular might have been Combate's best homegrown talent at that point. Like, she was 5-0 or 6-0, and all of her fights had been in Combate. She won a split decision that night. The bad news is she should have lost. But I mean, she won a split decision. Really, Yana should have won that fight, or at best, it should have been a draw, giving Yanez a 10-8 round for the round that she basically sat on Martinez's chest the whole round and like pelted her. Then Martinez disappeared for most of 4 years, and what really happened is she was supposed to have a rematch with Yanez, and that hit right around the time COVID did. She left Combate, I think primarily because they shut down so hard for COVID. She was casting about for any organization that could get her fights. She signed with the UFC, didn't end up getting to debut until 2022, lost, and then she's had a couple of fights canceled or postponed since then. So basically, she was one of the more intriguing strawweight prospects, globally, in my opinion, at least. And now she's 27 years old. She hasn't won a fight in almost 5 years. But at least at the time of the Reed fight, she still was the fighter that I was excited about. A fighter that was clearly pretty green and learning her craft, but had that mix of aggression and, if not like jump out of the gym athleticism, just the kind of high motor athleticism that made her a quick study at just about everything. I would have compared her to like a strawweight like a strawweight Macy Barber, where, you know, when Macy Barber was still 7-0 or 8-0, you would have been hard pressed to point out, okay, what is she really good at? Because she's kind of good at everything, but a lot of her like best results, you know, were coming from finding ways to get other women on the ground, even if they weren't like textbook wrestling techniques, and then just having good athleticism, strength, instincts on the ground and in scrambles, and just being able to really just beat women up on the ground or keep it standing and like hammer on them with a pretty basic repertoire of strikes that were made more effective just by her being strong and quick. That's still her. And a lot of similar things could be said about Ardelean, but Ardelean is older, isn't quite the athlete. Like, the only thing Ardelean really has going for her, in my opinion, here is that she's been busier than Martinez. Like, I mean, she's fought almost her entire career in the time Martinez, you know, has had her one UFC fight. I think this will be a fun fight. Both women like to stand in the pocket and trade. That makes for fun fights. Both of them are perfectly willing to go to the ground and just trust their work in scrambles. That also makes for fun fights. So I think this one should be a lot of fun, but unless something has happened to make Martinez really damaged goods, and I don't think that should be the case because most of her fizzled fights have been because her opponent withdrew, I think she's just going to be a step ahead of Ardelean the whole time. Even if it takes a round to kind of kick the rust off, get the timing back, I'd have her at worst winning the second and third rounds and kind of winning this thing going away. Give me Martinez by decision.
I would say that, you know, you said 2 years ago, Ardelean was best known for you know, her side gig. We'll say she's still known for that primarily, I would say. And then Martinez, she's been missing in action for so much that at this point, when the UFC was trying to tout her and David Martinez as the first brother and sister combination, people were saying, "Who? Melissa? I don't know who that is." Yeah. But hey, at the same time, the UFC was doing a disservice to the Inoues, Mizuki and Naoki. That's actually the first brother-sister combo. But anyway, random trivia crap out of the way.
That's what Mizuki gets for going just by one name.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
The UFC forgets that she has a last name. But I remember feeling the same way pretty much with regards to you with Martinez. You know, when she first came in, I thought she was a prospect that had a lot of potential. A little bit disappointed in her showing against Reed because I thought that was one of those contests that the UFC was trying to set her up for a win. You know, they got a young, attractive Mexican prospect making their way up who could make some serious noise. Typically, somebody like that, they're trying to get him a win. And what kind of surprised me was how much she struggled with Reed's physicality. That completely caught me off guard. I thought that was something that Martinez would be able to have in the bag. And against Ardelean, that kind of scares me because, you know, Ardelean's she's not a great athlete, but she is the ultimate try hard. She's not gonna quit on herself, and you know she got a badonkadonk. She knows how to throw that around. She did that a lot with Shauna Bannon, and you know that wasn't the most impressive fight, but given the amount of notice that Ardelean took that fight on and how well she performed, she actually kind of caught me by surprise. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I think Ardelean can pull this one off, but that's also knowing that Martinez has fought once in the last 5 years. She could be making amazing strides. She could be a completely different fighter from when we last saw her. But if I'm going off of just what I have seen, I think Ardelean has a very good chance for the upset. So I'll say she does it in a split decision scramble fest, much like you said.
There we go. We have our first disagreement of the evening. Just 2 fights into this card. Buckle up, folks. It's about to get hostile in here. I'm just kidding. It's not going to get hostile. We stay in the strawweight division on the UFC Fight Night 245 prelims as 41-year-old Jessica Penne looks to get back in the win column against Elise Reed. Penne, longtime Southern California resident, 14-7 overall, 3-5 in the UFC, and she is on a 2-fight losing streak dating back over 2 years. She's basically fought once per year for the last couple of years. This will be her first cage appearance of 2024. Last time we saw her was all the way back last March at UFC 285, where she got armbarred in the second round by Tabitha Ricci. So she's looking to snap the win streak. She'll need to get past Reed to do it. Reed, 31-year-old New Jersey native, is 7-4 overall. She's 3-4 since joining the UFC as a multiple division standout in CFFC. She's coming in off a loss, and she has, in fact, alternated losses and wins throughout her entire UFC run. But she fought almost exactly a year ago at the Noche UFC Grasso versus Shevchenko 2, where she got tapped out in the second round by Lupi Godinez, much to the delight, I'm sure, of the Noche UFC fans. So if you are following the pattern here and you think Reed is due to get back in the win column, the odds makers are with you, as Reed is minus 160, Penne plus 130. I'll go ahead and flip this one to you, Dayne. Jessica Penne, does she have one more win in the tank, or does Elise Reed get back on track? How does this fight play out?
This is one of those that I think Penne has a very good chance to pull out. She's 41. Like you already said, which is very worrisome, particularly for the smaller weight classes. I know that with the women, we haven't quite figured out the science of how well they age quite yet, because Marion Renault was in her mid-40s, I believe, when she finally called it quits. But at the same time, that was at 135, and typically age catches you the smaller that you are. So, and Penne's not a big straw weight either. She was the atomweight champion at in Invicto once upon a time. That was over a decade ago. So the UFC is matching her up in a variable winnable fight with Reed, because Reed isn't exactly somebody known for their physicality either, and that's something that Penne has struggled with. Her win over Lupe Godinez aside, that was Godinez's UFC debut, so that one I feel like was more of a fluke. And if I remember correctly, most of us thought Godinez won it anyway. But that aside, Penne's got her primary weapon on the feet at this point is a jab. She doesn't offer too much else there. She's got a very tricky ground game that, if she can get that going, could get Reed into a lot of trouble, because I don't see enough on the ground that I trust Reed to be able to survive for long stretches there. At the very least, not win the ground game. And if I'm not mistaken, let's see here, I believe 2 of Reed's 4 UFC losses were submission. Yeah. The one, like you said, by Godinez, and then also to Luma Lukboonmi.
Yeah.
I can't talk. Luma Lukboonmi. There we go. I said it correctly, finally. So this is something that's very doable for Penne. At the same time, Reed is somebody that I feel like constantly gets overlooked. Like you said, there's not a whole lot that she does incredibly well. If there is something that I could point to that and say that she does do well, is she's pretty good on the counter, provided she's given the room to be able to take that type of a fight. That hasn't always happened. The aggressive fighters like Lukboonmi and Godinez gave her no chance of that. She was completely outmuscled by Sijara Eubanks, but that was also, Eubanks should be fighting 135 and Reed's a 115er. So, that was kind of a given. But I was impressed with Reed in her victory over Martinez, in the sense that she did show that if she needs to, she can take the fight to the ground and be the more physical fighter. Now, I don't necessarily think that she's going to try to take the fight to the ground with Penne, but I think she can be the more physical fighter with Penne, especially given that Father Time catches up with all of us. And Penne has not looked great, even as she has aged. I mean, don't get me wrong, her her little resurgence, picking up the wins over Godinez and Kovalkiewicz. It was great to see, because I feel like she kind of had her name tainted with that long PED suspension that was controversial. Happy to see her get some sort of retribution with regards to that, but at this point, it's been a year and a half since we last saw her, and I feel like I've underestimated Reed one too many times. Well, I shouldn't say one too many times, just too much. And I'm going to say that I think that she is the better striker, and I think that she can stuff whatever takedowns attempts that Penne gets. So I'll say Reed in a unanimous decision.
I like something that you mentioned there, because I certainly can relate. I have underestimated Elise Reed repeatedly during her UFC run. And for the record, I still don't think she's necessarily a future contender, let alone champ at strawweight, but I assumed she was going to be 3 and gone. I mean, even after Sijara Eubanks splattered her, I was like, oh, okay, now she'll drop to 115 and probably lose her next 2. And like, she just won't make it. And I had watched her fights in CFFC. I was like, yeah, you know, she's pretty good, but she wasn't screaming UFC material to me. But she is an example, and there are plenty of fighters that are examples of this. She's an example of a fighter who may have been a marginal prospect when she got signed, but simply getting signed to the UFC and perhaps being able to train full time for the first time in her career allowed her to turn a corner. And it allowed her to turn a corner specifically in her physicality. Like, she just clearly has a different strength and conditioning regimen than she had 3 or 4 years ago. She's still not Jessica Andrade at 115, but it's not every fighter that can push and shove her around at strawweight anymore. And Jessica Penne definitely will not be one of those. Like, you know, Penne is a nifty, tricky, but kind of finesse-based grappler who was never more than an okay striker. Like, in her, like, even in her prime, her striking was kind of a means to an end, like a way to stay in the fight from round to round while waiting for an opportunity to get the fight to the ground on her terms. And now at 41, or at least last time we saw her at 40, whatever striking chops she had have been sapped, just as her hand speed has slowed, her foot speed has slowed, her ability to just react and recover from punishment has waned. Like, you know, we all remember her shot at Joanna Jędrzejczyk, and that was an absolute slaughter. But it's worth noting that for 2.5 rounds, Penne kept marching forward gamely and trying to get the fight to the ground any way she could, where she knew was basically her only chance of, you know, of winning the title. Same for her next fight against Jessica Andrade. Like, she used to be able to take an impressive amount of punishment in the pursuit of her game. And I know that sounds kind of like a backhanded compliment, but Jessica Penne, if she was ever going to be a UFC champ, it was going to be by walking through a ton of damage and getting the fight, you know, to the ground on her terms. I don't think she has the ability to do that anymore. And while Elise Reed, again, is no Jessica Andrade, she is kind of the kind of crisp, patient boxer that I think can just punish Penne as Penne comes forward for 3 rounds, getting increasingly busted up. I'm feeling Reed by a pretty one-sided decision here, but if Penne has really fallen off in the last 18 months, I could see Reed getting a finish out of just an accumulation of damage on just a beat up, tired, frustrated Penne. That would be a sad way for her to go out, because, as you mentioned, it was kind of a fun resurgence when she came back from that ridiculously draconian 4-year suspension, and all of a sudden won a couple of fights. You know, if nothing else, I have it circled as the only time I've ever heard Dominic Cruz be happy in public about something. So, I mean, you know, heaven forfend we get another moment like that. I don't think it's coming, though. I think this is going to be a bad night for Penne as well. Give me Reed by one-sided decision. We head next to the women's bantamweight division, where Joselyne Edwards and Tamires Vidal will square off. Edwards, the 29-year-old Panamanian training out of Southern California, is 13-6 overall. She's an even 4-4 in the UFC. She is coming in on a 2-fight losing streak, having dropped back-to-back fights to Eileen Perez and Nora Cornell going back just about a year. Prior to that, she had been on a 3-fight win streak. She will be certainly looking to start a new one here at the expense of Vidal. Vidal, 26-year-old Brazilian, is 7-3 overall. She is 1-2 in the UFC. She won her UFC debut with a highlight reel knockout, a body shot knockout of Ramona Pascual. Since then, she has had back-to-back losses to Montserrat Rendon and Melissa Gatto. The most recent of those, the Gatto fight, was back in May at UFC Fight Night, Barboza versus Murphy, where she got put down and finished with a body punch early in the 3rd round. So 2 women looking to get back some positive momentum in the wide open bantamweight division. Edwards is heavily favored to do so. She's minus 250, Vidal plus 200. You mentioned in our breakdown of one of the women's strawweight fights, it would have been the Penne versus Reed fight, that, we haven't quite got a handle on how women age in those divisions compared to like the men's divisions that have just been going longer and are more established. One thing I will feel comfortable saying about women's 135 is it feels like men's light heavyweight to me, where the light heavyweight division for men, it's always been the star power division. Like, some of the biggest names have always passed through there, but that sort of hides the fact that it's always been a shallow division. Like even during the Randy Chuck Tito on, this side of the Pacific era, and, Overeem, Shogun, Vanderlei over in Japan, even at just that peak, if you look at who the number 8 or number 12 light heavyweight in the UFC was at the time, it wasn't great. Like it's always been always been kind of a shallow division. I feel like women's bantamweight is the same way. Like most of the biggest stars in women's MMA history have been bantamweights, Ronda, Amanda, Misha, but south of them, even at the highlight of, the height of when Ronda and Misha and Holly were passing the title around, you look at who the 10th best woman in the division was, and it's like, it fell off. That's women's bantamweight to me. And it's similar again in that if you look at the top 10 fighters, they will all have certain skills that they are elite at, but it's possible to get into the top 10, get into the top 5, get a title shot with serious flaws in your game. And that simply isn't possible in other divisions. Like you look at the 5 or 6 best lightweights in the world or welterweights, like they're all good at everything. They're all at least pretty good at everything. Joselyne Edwards, that's all my long way around to saying Joselyne Edwards is a very good striker. When somebody obliges her with a striking match at her pace and at her distance, I think she can hang with anybody in the division. And I'm sure that's weird to say about someone who's 500 in the division, but like right up to the champ, the thing is, no one really has to oblige her with that because her takedown defense is so bad. Like it's almost admirable that she's 4-4 in the UFC when the path to beating her is so obvious and has been made so manifest. Like you almost have to look at the Lucia Pudilovas and Ramona Pascuals and be like, why didn't you take her down? Why did you just let her kick you for 3 rounds? There's always the chance that she'll turn a corner. She's at King's MMA. It's a very good gym. It has plenty of outstanding instruction, outstanding training partners, but thus far, I mean, she goes over like one of those, when I was like 6, my parents got me one of those like kid boxing things that, it was inflated and just had the sandbag in the bottom. So you just punch it and it would just go straight down. Like that's like her takedown defense. And it's what made her such easy prey for like Eileen Perez, where Eileen Perez just wants to run across the cage, throw a couple hooks, and then bowl the other woman over and sit on her chest and punch her. That's why I'm not feeling Edwards as a 2.5-1 favorite here, because Vidal is a super, super raw fighter I mean, she's still just 26 years old. I think she got signed to the UFC too early. Like she could have stood some more seasoning in South America, but she is built like a tank. While she doesn't have a textbook double leg or single leg, and in fact, most of the takedowns I've seen her get wouldn't have names. Like the technique wouldn't even have a name. It's effective, and you don't have to have a John Smith low single to bring down Joselyne Edwards. Edwards is a minus 250 favorite, and for her to get the win, I think Vidal will just have to kind of stand on the outside and let Edwards kick her for 3 rounds. And if she does, Edwards is going to look like $1 million because Edwards has really good kicks. They're fast. They're not telegraphed. She's gotten bolder about throwing them to all levels. You know, she'll throw to the legs, change it up, throw one to the body. When fighters try to come inside, crash inside the pocket, get inside a kicking range, she has good straight punches with nice pop on them. You know, and she's usually throwing them even as the other woman crashes right into her and bowls her over 2 seconds later. And maybe this is going to come back and haunt me on the recap because I'm picking Vidal in this fight in what's a pretty decent upset just based on Vidal and her handlers presumably having watched the tape on Edwards, seen how easy it is to get her down. And while Edwards's get-up game has improved, she doesn't just lay with her hips and shoulder blades flat on the mat anymore. There's no reason that just means Vidal could get 11 takedowns instead of just needing 3. And until I see otherwise, as long as it's this easy to get Joselyne Edwards down, I have a hard time picking her as a favorite over someone like Vidal. So give me Vidal in the upset here by decision. I'd love to be wrong.
So I loved your tangent with regards to the light heavyweight division first. Do you remember who Randy Couture beat before the third match with Chuck? Because he took a big step down in order to get a win before he fought Chuck again.
Oh, was that the Brandon Vera one?
Mike Van Arsdale.
Oh. Mike Van Arsdale. Wow. So a dream matchup for fans of early 90s college wrestling. Wow. Mike Van Arsdale. But
that just really emphasizes what you're saying. You know, there was, you know, you had the top that everybody knew the names: Chuck, Tito, Vitor, and Randy, you know, but once you got past those 4, there was very little, you know, to the point where that's who Randy fought because, well, let's find somebody he hasn't fought. I guess Van Arsdale won his last fight. We'll go with him.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's the same. It's like before Tough kind of cemented the Chuck Randy rivalry as the thing that would bridge the 2 eras. They were pulling Jeremy Horn out of the regionals because Horn beat him in like 1998, you know, or he was just throwing hammers at Vernon Tiger White, who at the time was like 26 and 18, mostly at welterweight. Anyway, as I always say on the closings of these, you'll get occasional historical asides. Dayne is down with our game. Yeah.
Keith's not the only one that can do it. Yeah. And along those lines, for Vitor to get his title shot against Randy, it was Marvin Eastman that he beat. So again, you know, big steep decline throughout there. So, but
Houston's own Marvin Eastman. We barely knew
the
you.
Beastman.
Yeah.
But anyway, back to the fight. I'd rather talk about light heavyweight division 20 years ago than this fight. So that'll tell you how awesome this one is, right? I really can't disagree with anything that you said. Vidal she certainly has some knockout power, which is enough in women's bantamweight to do some serious damage. The problem is at this point that largely seems to be about the only thing that she has. It's enough that, you know, she easily could take this one. But I also worry about the fact that the one knockout win that she has in the UFC is Ramona Pasquale. And Pasquale was glacial in her movement, so it wasn't very difficult for Vidal to be able to find the flying knee that she damn near killed her with. And with regards to Edwards, yes, she's incredibly easy to take down. But she has ascribed to the idea that the best defense is even more offense. And she took that to heart with her contest against Nora Cornell. She didn't win that fight, but she scored a bunch of takedowns to the point where, as you're watching the fight, you're like, okay, are the judges going to score this on control, or are they going to score this on damage? If they went with control, there was a legit case for Edwards to be made. Given that damage is far more heavily valued these days, I think the right decision was made and Cornell got the win. But against somebody like Vidal, who I question whether or not she has the ability to stand tall, I think that Edwards will probably use a good mix of takedowns and just piecing her up, because there's a lot to dislike about Edwards. But like you said, if somebody's willing to stand and bang with her, and I think Vidal thinks that she can do that. She's got the confidence that and has the power to do it. I think that she'll fall into a trap. Edwards will piece her up enough, score some timely takedowns, and I just don't trust that Vidal, as young as she is in her career, that she's going to make the attempt to take Edwards down as often as she should. So I'll say that Edwards gets a unanimous decision victory.
We stay in the bantamweight division and simply move over to the other locker room as Brad Katona and Gene Matsumoto face off. Katona, the 32-year-old Canadian, is 14-3 overall. He is 4-3 in the UFC across two separate stints with the promotion. He is 2-1 since being back a little over a year ago as the first ever two-time winner of the Ultimate Fighter in two different weight classes. He won Tough 27 at featherweight back in like 2017 or 2018. He won Tough 31 at bantamweight last August at UFC 292, beating Cody Gibson. Since then, he has a decision loss to Garrett Armfield, and in his most recent appearance in June, a decision win over Jesse Butler. That was at UFC on ESPN, Cannonier versus Imavov. He will look to make it two in a row here at the expense of Matsumoto, who will be looking to keep his unbeaten record intact. 25-year-old Brazilian, a perfect 15-0 as a professional. He is 1-0 since joining the UFC out of season 7 of Dana White's Contender Series. He made his debut back in April at UFC Fight Night, Allen versus Curtis 2, where he got a second-round buzzer-beating submission of Dan Argueta. Basically choked Argueta all the way to sleep, like laying on top of him. He'll probably doesn't want it to be quite that interesting this time, but wants to pick up his 16th win. He is heavily favored to do so. Matsumoto is minus 270, Katona plus 220. Man, on the one hand, you have to ask, how does somebody at 135 pounds, what now these days, one of the UFC's glamour divisions, get to 15-0, win his UFC debut, and not have more hype behind him than he has right now? Like you think of people who've come along like Muhammad Mokaev, Ian Gary. Matsumoto, nowhere near that level of hype. It's easy to forget. I mean, Sherdog puts out a monthly article. I mean, it's barely an article. It's just a list of undefeated fighters in the UFC. And it's always surprising how many there are, but it makes sense that I would miss some of them. Like, oh, right, that guy, he's 7-0. He fought on the Contender Series like 13 months ago and then got injured. How could I possibly forget him? But then I'm like, who is this 14-0 guy? Oh, right. And I remember why I forget him. I'm not saying Matsumoto isn't good, and I'm not saying that he isn't potentially a future contender, but he is a shining example of a guy that has gotten to 15-0 just by not having faced the right guy yet, in my opinion. In order to stay undefeated in an individual sport as chaotic as MMA, it takes a little luck. You'll need a little luck along with the skill, the heart, all the other things. But Matsumoto, when you look at his game, he's a good striker. Like, he throws a good diversity of strikes. He can throw pretty well off the back foot as well as when he's coming forward, which is fairly rare. There's some very good strikers who never get good at that. Just ask Edson Barboza. But his takedown defense has always been iffy at best, and he doesn't have crushing kill shot power. In fact, you could argue that he's a better finisher on the ground, like talking about submissions, than on the feet. But even there, most of his submissions are really early in his career. If you look at his later regional career, when he was closer to the fighter he is now, let alone him on the Contender Series and in his UFC debut, like, he doesn't go to the ground by choice. His ideal fight is him winning a striking battle for 3 or 5 rounds and staying upright. And his takedown defense just isn't that great. And again, he doesn't have one shot kill shot power that's like a serious deterrent. So you look at the Argueta fight. He lost the first round, and he lost the first 4.5 minutes of the second round till he stunned Argueta with a punch, slapped on a guillotine when Argueta kind of shot the panic single leg and choked him all the way out. Otherwise, he was on his way to maybe taking his first career loss right there. There are a lot of bantamweights in the UFC that I would feel comfortable taking over Matsumoto on Saturday. Not even talking about ranked ones, just middling dudes who I think could take Matsumoto down and kind of pelt him and keep him on the defensive for at least 2 rounds out of 3. And in terms of skills, Katona is one of them. Katona is kind of his own worst enemy. He's 4-3 in the UFC. I mean, he's 2-1 since being back, but he is a good athlete. He has good cardio. He's well-rounded. He's a good wrestler. He's a good striker. But because he isn't much of a finisher, and because he isn't a super, super high motor, high pace guy, he's not like a Merab type who just, it's clear that he's trying to overwhelm his opponent with pace. Katona isn't much of a round winner. And if you're not a finisher or a round winner, you become a talented guy who hangs around at around 500 in the UFC, which is exactly what Katona is. I think the line on this one should be a lot closer than it is, because Katona can take Matsumoto down if he wants. And if they just hang out on the feet, I don't think Matsumoto is leagues ahead of Katona either. But I don't even trust Katona to do what Dan Argueta tried to do. Argueta clearly just, I mean, he shot early, he shot often, he put a pace on Matsumoto. Matsumoto was clearly uncomfortable. And again, fair play to him. It was a fantastic kind of club and sub finish, but that's not a replicable path to victory if you want to do that all the way to a bantamweight title shot. That's not going to work. Matsumoto needs to develop some other routes to victory. I don't know if he'll have them on Saturday, but I'm saying he has enough to get past Katona. I could see this being a frustrating fight. I'm not a betting man, but if I were, I wouldn't bet on this one because, again, I don't like Matsumoto as almost a 3-1 favorite, but I also don't like Katona as an underdog. So this is not even a dog or pass. This is a pass or pass fight for me. Give me Matsumoto, and you can see the split decision coming a million miles away on this one. I don't usually call the split, but yeah, give me Matsumoto by split decision in a fight that makes almost nobody happy.
Yeah, no, I pretty much everything that you said, I would absolutely 100% agree with. Katona feels like the sum is less than the parts, if that makes any sense. You know, like you add everything together and the final product that you get, you're just like, huh, I thought that there would be more there. Because he's incredibly technical. He has zero problems with his gas tank. He's always able to go a full 15 without any issues. He can wrestle some. And in his battle with Cody Gibson, he showed that he does have some power when he's willing to sit down. He just rarely sits down. So you look at that and you think Katona should be better than what he is. But for whatever reason, I don't know if it's coaching, camp, or I don't even want to say fight IQ, because generally when I watch him, I'm like, oh yeah, he's a smart fighter. He knows what he's doing. I don't know what it is, but there's something that holds Katona back from being a better fighter than what he is. with regards to Matsumoto, he's still very much of a mystery to me. Because you look at the people that he's fought, and a lot of these Brazilians that get to 15-0, it's because they're can crushing. But Matsumoto hasn't fought some, it hasn't been a bunch of cans that he's been crushing. He's been fighting some decent competition there. He's still young. I believe he's 25.
Yeah, he's 25.
Yeah, 25. That's right. So, yeah, still has a good chunk of upside. But at the same time, I 100% agree with you that the reason why he's undefeated is he has not met the right opponent yet. Can I see him perhaps playing on the fringe of the top 15 one of these days? Sure, I could see that. But he definitely does not come across as a future contender. Nevertheless, he is just 25, which means that he still has a lot of learning and growing. I have a feeling that he probably learned a lot from the contest that he had with Argueta. And even though he was taken down a lot, he got up a lot. And Katona, while he can score takedowns, he usually does not control his opponents for long periods of time. So I do anticipate that this fight will be largely contested on the feet. I think Katona will probably land some takedowns, but I don't think that they're going to be too consequential. And in those terms, I think Matsumoto having the bigger, longer, and more athletic frame, I think that's going to make a difference for him with regards to winning the striking battle. I'll say it just to be different, but also because there's not a single fight that Brad Katona has been in the UFC that hasn't gone to unanimous decision, whether or not he wins or loses. So I'll say Matsumoto by unanimous decision.
All right. Next up at UFC Vegas 99, and at least as the card is constituted as of the beginning of fight week, the main card opener is a men's flyweight contest between Matheus Nicolau and Asu Almabaev. Nicolau, the 31-year-old Brazilian, is 19-4-1 overall. He's 9-3 in the UFC. He's on a 2-fight losing streak. He fought his way all the way to the fringes of title contention. In fact, his bout with Brandon Royval last April may well have resulted in a title shot for him if he'd won. However, he didn't win. Starting with the Royval fight, he got knocked out there in the first round, came back this April and got knocked out in the second round by Alex Perez. He's on the first losing streak of his career. Clearly, he would like to snap that, prove that he still belongs in the title discussion. In order to do so, he will have to get past Almabaev. 30-year-old from Kazakhstan is 20-2 overall. He is 3-0 since joining the UFC a little over a year ago. He's already fought twice this year, picking up unanimous decisions over CJ Vergara in March and Jose Johnson in June. The Nicolau fight certainly represents a step up from those two in terms of competition, but he is favored to get it done nonetheless. Almabaev -190, Nicolau +160. I'll go ahead and flip this one to you. Let me know how you think this fight goes. And I mean, it'll be implied in your pick for the fight, but I am curious whether you think Nicolau has anything left in the tank for a contender run at flyweight, or we've seen the beginning of the end with these back-to-back knockouts.
Yeah, flyweight is kind of weird with regards to the age of fighters. Again, the lighter weight fighters we talked about earlier, we have a pretty good idea, but there's always exceptions to the rule. And at 31, any other division, you're like, oh, no, they're right in their prime. Whereas with flyweight, you're worried that Nicolau's probably already seen his best days behind him at this point. But I'm not ready to give up on him yet. Brandon Royval has proven to be one of the toughest sons of bitches, not just in the flyweight division, in the UFC. That guy's got gas for days. He's never going to run out of gas. You can put him in a 15-round fight, and I think he's still going to be going at the end of it. And he's called Raw Dog for a reason, not just for the obvious reasons that you might think of. But he's also willing to take risks, and that is something that Nicolau does not typically account for. He crosses the T's, dots the I's with everything that he expects to happen in a fight. And with Royval, it's impossible to be able to account for what he's going to do. So I think that kind of explains that loss. The Perez fight, that one is a lot harder to explain because Perez is one of those who he faced a difficult run of opponents that he lost to. And so I think a lot of us were just kind of counting him out. And I get the feeling that Nicolau kind of did that as well. He probably figured that it was going to be an easier day at the office than what it really was. Perez had something to prove, and Nicolau got caught sleeping. I think at this point Nicolau knows he's not a favorite of the office. He has a fairly boring style where he's always looking to counter. If you take a gander at his numbers on UFC stats, it's always very much nip and tuck with regards to the amount of strikes landed between him and his opponent. There's several cases where his opponent landed more, but he still walked out with his arm raised due to the fact that he was landing the more effective shot off of the counter. So UFC typically doesn't reward fighters with those types of performances. The problem is they also can't necessarily ignore his success. So if he wasn't such a good fighter, they probably would have cut him already, coming off of 2 losses in a row. So I think he knows he's got to perform here because he's facing somebody who has yet to score a win over a name opponent. Almabaev is looking to make Nicolau that name that he can build upon. And so what does Almabaev do best? He comes forward and he looks for takedowns nonstop. In his 3 UFC fights, he has, 17 combined takedowns. And keep in mind, flyweight is a very scrambly division. It's not the hardest division to complete a takedown on. So anybody who can get 17 takedowns over 3 fights in the flyweight division, hats off. That's a fantastic wrestler. Aside from that, though, I think that he's also lacking on his defense. And in my mind, somebody that lacks on their defense and is going to be looking for takedowns all the time, hard charging against Nicolau, is probably in for a long night. Because while Nicolau is always looking for the counter, he's also one of the best guys at stopping a takedown. People don't think of Nicolau when they think of a great scrambler, but that's because he usually is able to prevent the scramble from happening in the first place. So if he can avoid getting into those types of battles with Almabaev, I think that this is the type of fight where Almabaev's running forward with his chin enough that he eats a couple of hard shots, and after a while, the accumulation ends up being lights out for him. Nicolau gets a very much needed important stoppage for him to stop the bleeding and at least say to the UFC, hey, I can be exciting. So we'll say Nicolau TKO second round.
All right, man. I like the way you kind of sum up Nicolau there, because he is not a boring fighter by the standards of most divisions. Like the top 15 at flyweight, they're all so well-rounded. They're all so athletic. They all have such good cardio. It's just that a lot of them are also incredibly aggro. I mean, we've just talked about Brandon Royval, Alex Perez, Brandon Moreno, who won, played hot potato with the title for like 2 full years. The best fighters in the division are almost recklessly aggressive in a way that's not true of any other division. And Nicolau, as one of the few counter-oriented strikers and as one of the few more positionally sound as opposed to freewheeling grapplers in that division, like he's only boring compared to these other guys. I'm with you. There are a lot of questions to be answered about him. And normally, with Almabaev being the one who should be more of a mystery, the guy who's more recently arrived from the CIS, who hasn't fought anyone even close to Nicolau's level, with all due respect to the 3 people he's beaten so far. Almabaev would be the one with the bigger question marks over him, but Nicolau has just as many. Is his chin compromised in any permanent way by these performances over the last year and a half? I can see Nicolau springing the upset here exactly as you describe it. Almabaev's wrestling has, and just his motor, his persistence, his almost, it's almost a flyweight Merab Dvalishvili, the way he approaches it, where, okay, my first takedown attempt may not get you down, but my 5th will, and they're all coming within the first 45 seconds of this round. That kind of just overwhelming with pace. Like it's covered up a few bad habits. Like, I think he's still at best just kind of a serviceable striker. He comes forward, he throws willingly, but kind of like Merab, he throws everything hard, and when he does kick, he kicks with the gleeful abandon of somebody who's not afraid of being taken down. But he's a short guy with a short reach, and throwing lots of looping stuff just makes his reach deficiencies even worse. Again, a little bit like Merab. Those are all things that Nicolau can make him pay for. Nicolau is a big, strong guy for the division. He's patient and accurate on the counter. Like, I can see Almabaev getting on Nicolau's hips and dumping him to the mat in the first 20 seconds. I could also see Nicolau just stepping out the side and starting to snipe Almabaev in the side of the head, just with, clean counters. I'm really tempted to go for the upset, same as you, but if Nicolau is already turning old at age 31, he would hardly be the first flyweight we've seen that happen to. I'm going to say that the Almabaev Express keeps rolling, though might be harder sledding than some people are expecting. But give me Almabaev to win a decision here, kind of wear on Nicolau. I could see Nicolau putting up a, really stern defense. Maybe Almabaev goes like 1 for 4 on his takedowns in the first round, and the one takedown, he can't keep Nicolau down for any appreciable time, but he just gets more and more success as he goes along. Nicolau gets more and more tired, where I don't think Almabaev will tire as quickly. So give me Almabaev by decision here. Next up on the UFC Vegas 99 main card is a featherweight matchup between Darren Elkins and Daniel Pineda. Elkins, the 40-year-old Indiana native, is 28-11 overall. He's 18-10 in the UFC. He's coming in off a win. He fought almost exactly a year ago at UFC Fight Night, Yusuf versus Barboza, where he tapped out TJ Brown in the 3rd round. He will look to make it 2 in a row, even at age 40, in a division that is not typically kind to the elderly. In order to do so, he'll have to get past a gentleman pretty much in the same situation in the form of 39-year-old Daniel Pineda. Pineda, fighting out of Houston, 28-16 with 3 no contests overall. He's 5-7 with 1 no contest across multiple stints in the UFC. He's 2-3 with 1 no contest since being back. And in between, he was the LFC at the time, not even LFA, featherweight champ. He was a 2-division featherweight and lightweight champ in Fury. Definitely a tried and true veteran of the regionals. But right now he's in the UFC and he's on a 2-fight losing streak, those being decision losses to Alex Caceres last June and a decision loss to Nathaniel Wood at UFC 304 in July. So Pineda looking to snap that losing streak, even as he presumably gets ready to transition into his next phase as the head coach at 4 Ounce Fight Club, where he brings up new talents for the UFC, such as Josh Van. Odds here, close to a pick'em, but Pineda is your slight favorite. He is -130, Elkins +110. I will go right out and say, even though it is a 40-year-old featherweight against a 39-year-old featherweight, I love this fight. Darren Elkins has always been one of Keith's and my dudes. I mean, we like wrestlers, we like overachievers, we like guys that are just tougher than shoe leather. Darren Elkins, all of the above.
Hall of fucking awesome, right?
First ballot. Like,
yeah,
first
100%.
ballot. Like, the minute I am dead sure that he is not going to fight again, he's in. It's kind of like I've got Matt Brown in the holding pattern right now. Just, I don't believe him just yet. Matt, don't do it. Awesomeness awaits you if you just stay retired. You can go bare knuckle if you want, or go slap people. I won't even see it, but just don't get back in the cage. Anyway, I guess if I were to pick somebody, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, like, Elkins would have been the kind of guy that I would have picked to still be having that kind of success. If you like if you lined up every 30-year-old featherweight in the UFC 10 years ago and we're like, which of these people will still be having similar success? I'd be like, probably Darren Elkins, because his game doesn't really run on top-notch athleticism now. There's nothing he's doing now that he couldn't be doing 10 years from now. Very much like a featherweight Court McGee in that way. Like, if he's good enough to weather the storm and then start wrestling you when you get tired, Darren Elkins is going to give you trouble. That's who he was years ago. It's who he still is now. And as he showed against TJ Brown, it's not some lay and pray thing. Like, if you're on the ground and you're really tired, he's not taking time off. He is building from round to round, just kind of growing in strength. And, he ended up tapping out Brown after really kind of dominating him on the ground for a while. That's Elkins. The scouting report on him has not changed appreciably in the entire time that I've been watching him. Daniel Pineda, you've watched these previews, before you were on this side of the camera with us. You know that I always issue caveats when I talk about, Texas fighters in general, but Houston fighters in particular. And Daniel Pineda is kind of the OG. He is now the head coach at the OG gym in Houston, 4 Ounce Fight Club. It's not the original, but it's the oldest one that's still open. He is a lot of the same things that you could say about Elkins. Pineda, for a while, was a venomous finisher that it really did run on athleticism and aggression, but that was a long time ago. That was 15 years and 3 or 4 positive drug tests ago. Like, Pineda, when he wins now, it tends to be more like the Elkins thing, where he's gonna take some damage early on, or at least just have a real tough time getting his game going against younger, fresher, bigger, because he's not large at all by modern featherweight standards, fighters. But if you get tired, if you start slipping defensively, we're talking about a guy with 28 career wins, and they are all finishes. 100% finishing rate from Fury FC all the way up to the UFC. He's a hard hitter, still has crisp, tight boxing, still throws in combination well, even at age 39. He's still a good offensive boxer. It's not as advisable that he spend as much time doing that at 39, just because loss of hand speed has hurt him defensively, and his ability to take punishment just isn't what it used to be. Like, that's one place where Elkins, I think, definitely outstrips Pineda at this point. But Pineda's venomously opportunistic grappling game is still there. He kind of announced himself on his return to the UFC. It was the most inauspicious return possible. He had gone and just detonated the PFL, then had a positive drug test that turned 2 first-round finishes into no contests. I was surprised the UFC had signed him at all. I figured I'd start seeing him every weekend at Fury. Did he just be a Houston guy forever? But showed up. They put him in against Herbert Burns, who is a huge featherweight, and by the way, a world champion grappler. And Pineda had to weather the storm for the first round. And then as soon as Burns got tired, Pineda swept him and just elbowed the shit out of him. He can still do that. Daniel Pineda, I can't, if you're watching this and you're like, oh, Daniel Pineda, you know, the guy that's like, he's like 500 in the UFC. He's okay, I guess. I can't convey to you how scary Daniel Pineda is. Like, Houston's a big town, has a lot of MMA fighters. I've said this before. I can't remember whether I've said it on the show, but yeah, if it's after a Fury one night and every fighter and every coach in Houston is at Waffle House and I see a chair go flying and I know shit's about to pop off, I'm going to run and hide behind Daniel Pineda. Like, I'm going to run right past Derek Lewis, Trevin Giles. I'm going to run past all those dudes. I'm going to hide behind 5'7" Daniel Pineda. And as Dev pointed out, it's because, you know, Pineda is probably carrying too. Like, yeah. But anyway, long way around. I expected the line to be close on this one, but if anything, I expected Elkins to be the slight favorite. I thought I'd be picking a bit of an upset here in picking Pineda, but it's two guys that neither of them is a super fast starter, especially at this point in their careers. Both are used to holding on and pulling ahead late. But for Elkins to pull ahead late, I think he'd have to start getting his wrestling going against Pineda. And while I'm sure he can take Pineda down, Pineda's takedown defense is not great, never has been. I don't think that'll be a real fun place for him to be. Pineda's just, he's super active off his back, either throwing up submissions, not even really to try. I don't think he's trying to actually triangle anybody off his back. He's just trying to keep the person on top uncomfortable so that they can't start throwing ground and pound, looking to create situations where he can sweep or at least initiate a scramble. Give me Pineda to win 2 rounds out of 3 here. And I think the line is what it is here for good reason. I could easily see Elkins, yes, getting the wrestling going late, but I'm saying Pineda is ahead going into round 3 and is either able to keep it on the feet or have things going on the ground on very even terms and squeaks out the win here.
You have said that Pineda is the guy that you're hiding behind, but I think
I need new material.
No, I think that's a good line. If it works, stick with it. Largely because, like you said, you know, people look at Derek Lewis and you just look at him and you're scared of him. Pineda is incredibly unassuming, but son of a bitch, if his record throughout his MMA career isn't a testament to what kind of a guy he is, you know, like you said, you don't go this deep into your career without winning a fight by decision. You know, that's not something that happens. He's, you know, MMA fighters in general are made of something different than everyday people. And even amongst MMA fighters, Daniel Pineda is made of something different. But along those lines, you know, you said Darren Elkins, first ballot, Hall of fucking awesome. And I 100% agree with you. The guy, he is quite possibly the most unathletic featherweight that the UFC has had in the past decade that has stuck around for any considerable amount of time. And he's done it just out of pure heart and toughness. You know, you're not going to stop this guy unless you absolutely put him out. And that it has been difficult to do as well. The problem is he's also been doing this for a very long time, and his MO has been to just keep pushing forward, absorb as much punishment as possible, and hopefully your opponent breaks mentally before they break him physically. And that works pretty well for him, especially given when you look at who the UFC has been matching him up with over the past 4 or 5 years. So let's see here. Okay, so starting in 2020, he fought Nate Landwehr. That was just basically a younger, shinier model of himself. Landwehr won that one. Next one was Eduardo Garagori. Garagori hits hard, but he can't stop a takedown. Elkins won that one. Derek Minner. He's got some power, but he's more known for his submission prowess. And Elkins, you know, he's savvy enough that he wasn't going to fall into one of Minner's traps. He won that fight. Cub Swanson. Swanson knocked him out quickly. I think it was like 2 minutes or something like that. And let's see here. Okay, yeah. And then after that, Tristan Connolly, another tryhard who just it doesn't have the same pedigree as Elkins. Elkins won that one. Lost to Jonathan Pierce, kind of a bigger version of Elkins, younger version as well, and then TJ Brown. All the fights that Elkins won, that's Garagori, Minner, Conley, Brown. Those are not guys who have had considerable UFC success. And I know that he's got wins in the past over the likes of Michael Johnson and Mirsad Bektic, but those were long ago enough that I don't think that they're necessarily relevant with regards to a 40-year-old Darren Elkins. I don't think that he can take the punishment that he used to. He can take a punch from TJ Brown. He can take a punch from Tristan Connolly. Can he take one from Daniel Pineda anymore, especially a fresh Daniel Pineda in the first round? If he couldn't take one from Cub Swanson 3 years ago, I don't trust that he can take one from Pineda, given how aggro that Pineda is. And Pineda proved he's still got power. It was Nathaniel Wood.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Nathaniel Wood was the last fight that he had.
Yeah,
and he came dangerously close to winning that one, hurting Wood on a couple of occasions. And Elkins, like we said, not a great athlete. His absorbing damage has always been a part of his game plan. And against somebody like Pineda, who has surprisingly maintained a lot of the athleticism that he had, I think that in this case, Pineda finds a early way to stop the fight. If he doesn't, I'm with you in the sense that it's going to be tooth and nail towards the end for the decision. But I think he gets it done early. At 40 years old, Elkins can't take the damage he used to, so first round KO for Pineda.
The UFC Fight Night 245 main card soldiers on with a men's bantamweight matchup between Brady Hiestand and Jake Hadley. Hiestand, the 25-year-old Washington State native, is 8-2 overall. He's 3-1 in the UFC. He joined as the bantamweight runner-up of season 29 of The Ultimate Fighter, coming up just short in a fight of the night type scrap with Ricky Turcios. Since then, he is perfect with wins over Fernie Garcia, Dana Batkari, and Garrett Armfield. The most recent of those, the Armfield fight, was back in June at UFC on ESPN, Perez versus Tyra, where he tapped out Armfield in the third round. He will look to make it 4 in a row and quietly mint himself one of the more intriguing rising prospects in the bantamweight division against Hadley, who is still looking to reclaim some of his prospect shine that he had when he joined the UFC a couple of years ago. 28-year-old Englishman is 11-3 overall. He is 3-3 since joining the UFC out of season 5 of Dana White's Contender Series. 3-3 overall, but 1-0 since moving up to bantamweight, or bantamweight plus, but we'll get to that in a moment. He had some mixed results coming into the UFC as an undefeated prospect. Tapped out Mitch Raposo on the Contender Series, but that was marred by the fact that Hadley blew weight for that fight. He had some mixed results at flyweight, took on Kalen Loughran in his most recent appearance, back at UFC 304, beat Loughran, but blew weight again. So he's now missed the weight. He missed weight in 2 different weight classes, though technically one of them was on the Contender Series. Nonetheless, at this point, he seems to think his best future lies at 135. We'll get to see on Saturday. He is not favored, but the line's pretty close. Hiestand is minus 150, Hadley plus 120 coming back. I'm going to toss this one to you, Dayne, but Jake Hadley, he arrived in the UFC around the same time as Tatsuro Taira, Muhammad Mokaev. He was undefeated as well. Nobody that I knew of was putting him in quite that same bucket with those other 2 super prospects, but nonetheless, he had a little bit of shine as a, Englishman with a little bit of talk to him and generally fun style. But at this point, I mean, he's a guy that's he's 500 in the UFC. He's missed weight a couple times. He might not be fighting for his job here, but certainly he's it'll be a long time before he's on the main card again if he loses here. Tell me if you still see any upside in him. Tell me who you think gets it done on Saturday.
There's still some upside in Hadley, and I do think for his long-term health, he is absolutely doing the right thing in moving up to bantamweight. He clearly was not capable of making 125 on a consistent basis, but I think in terms of his career and whether he should be emphasizing his health or his career, I'm not going to say. You know, these are MMA fighters. It's their decision to make. I don't know if moving up to 135 is what's best for him, given the fact that his strength was being a bullying grappler. It wasn't his wrestling. His wrestling, to say the least, disappointed since he came into the UFC. He was never able to get the fight to the ground consistently, but when he did get it there, he did pretty well. Showed some solid chops. Got a triangle submission, or no, triangle choke, yeah. Against give me a second to look at Carlos Candelario, yeah, in his sophomore UFC effort. You know, he's not bad on the ground. He's pretty good. The problem is while he was pretty big for flyweight, he's going to be on the smaller side at bantamweight. I know that he missed weight against Loughran, which generally would indicate that he's a larger fighter, but he also took that fight on incredibly short notice.
Yeah.
So I think that people are generally willing to give him a pass for missing weight on that one because he was saving a fight. So I think the UFC more or less looked the other way on that one as well. As far as his boxing goes, I think I don't want to say that it's I'm not going to say that it was considered to be poor when he came in, but I think he's been a little bit better than what most people expected. He's got some power. He knocked out Malcolm Gordon. The problem is damn near everybody was knocking out Malcolm Gordon. Poor guy just didn't have a chin. But against Brady Hiestand, he's facing somebody who is going to be bigger, somebody who is younger, and somebody who does not have a history of gassing in their fights. And the other thing that Hiestand does is he charges forward nonstop, looking for takedowns. He's kind of like we were talking about Asu Almabaev being a version of Merab Dvalishvili, and that's kind of what I think of when I think of Hiestand as well. He's not quite as manic. I think that there's a little bit more technique in what he does, and just not quite so psycho killer in his approach. To put it a colorful way. What Hiestand doesn't have, he's still working on his hands. He still has a way to go in that, but he's still young. He's 25 years old. He's not I don't necessarily know if he's at the right camp for that to improve his hands, but Jiu-Jitsu has proven to be able to mold some high level fighters with regards to the likes of Juliana Pena and Michael Chiesa. And if they can continue to emphasize his strengths, i.e. his motor and his ability to take fighters down and break them mentally, I think that he's got a bright future. And I think that is something that Hadley is susceptible to. You know, he's struggled with weight. He hasn't quite lived up to the hype. I think it's too early to say whether or not Hadley is a head case, but I think we've seen signs that he could be. And so I think that Hiestand's constant pressure could end up breaking him. So I think that the contest starts out pretty close. Hadley probably lands some good shots on the feet, maybe even takes the first round based on that. But I think Hiestand keeps coming. And by the end of the fight, it's going to be pretty clear. Hadley's a broken man, and Hiestand gets his hand raised in a unanimous decision.
Yeah, I can't really contradict anything you threw down there. Including, like, Hadley is starting to feel more and more to me, even though he's the older of these two guys by 3 years, like the one who is less of a finished product, and maybe got in a little too early for all this. I don't know if he's a head case. either, but you can see signs that it might be the case. He's a guy that, hell, I could see him washing out of the UFC, coming back at like 32 and just being a whole different fighter and going on a nice run. I'm not saying that's what will happen, but that wouldn't shock me. He will be, I mean, I think he'll be about average size for a UFC bantamweight, like not in terms of height or wingspan, but just say in terms of like in shape walking weight. I think he'll be right around the middle. But for a guy that is used to always being bigger, stronger, and being the bully, you know, what do they say? If you're used to privilege, then like equality feels like oppression. He might, you know, be experiencing a bit of that, but he looked okay against Kalen Loughran, and Kalen Loughran is like Irish Ram Man from the old He-Man figurines, you know, just a guy with like no neck. And he did okay. I do think this is a rough fight for him to figure out what kind of upside he has at 135, because Hiestand is better at most of the things that Hadley is good at and is younger and therefore presumably more likely to have made strides in the meantime. I can feel what you're saying about him being at Sikh Jitsu. Sikh Jitsu has always been a very idiosyncratic camp. Like they've had in very good success for, you know, a lot of their fighters, the most obvious ones, of course, being Chiesa and Penne, but they've had other fighters like, you know, Elizabeth Phillips and stuff that had more than a cup of coffee in the UFC. But, you know, just a very, like, you know, Rick Little has a kind of a unique style himself, teaches a unique style. We used to always hear coming out of there that he would, like, you know, yell at people and make them sit out for checking leg kicks. Hopefully they don't do that anymore. But I don't say never. It's very rare that I'd be the type of person to say a fighter would be well served from leaving camp A and going to camp B. But is Brady Hiestand the most team alpha male fighter ever not to be from team alpha male? Just like this good looking guy that wrestled a little bit in college and in MMA terms is a wrestle boxer with a high motor and a good front headlock. Like, he is the most team alpha male fighter ever not to be from team alpha. Hell, he looks like he could be Uriah Faber's cousin. But that he's been such a pleasant surprise, man. Like, you know, he came in a runner-up on The Ultimate Fighter. At this point, that was a little over 3 years ago. It was a bananas fight with Ricky Tercios. And I mean, I say this very cautiously, considering, again, like, I see Ricky Tercios most Wednesdays, you know, he's at my gym, but if they fight again now, I don't know if Tercios comes out on the right side of that split decision. Like, Hiestand was so young then and so used to being the guy that came out on top in wild scrambles, and Tercios was just an older, more experienced version of a guy that loves him a scramble. You know, my kid Adam, that's done a few of these shows, you know, with me, says Ricky Tercios fights like a stuntman. That is my favorite one-liner about him. Like, Hiestand, the way he's matured, become a little physically stronger, become just a little more positionally sound while still loving the scrambling aspects of wrestling and grappling. I think he probably beats Tercios if they fought again now. He's been a pleasant surprise for a guy that entered the UFC to very, very modest hype. And I think he's absolutely the wrong guy for Hadley to be facing on Saturday. I think this will be a very fun fight. I'm with you in that Hadley could definitely have some success on the feet, especially early. Just Hiestand coming forward and being a willing striker that has some lapses defensively. Hadley's a crisp enough boxer that I could see him hurting Hiestand in the stand-up early, but once Hiestand gets that first takedown, if not a head case, if it's premature to say that, I don't think it'd be premature to say that Hadley might be a little bit of a front runner, and I could see Hiestand with that high motor just building from round to round as Hadley gets more tired, more discouraged, more beat up. Give me Hiestand in a decision here where he wins going away, like he's pulling further and further ahead. And it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility to get a late stoppage where he either pounds out or taps out. Again, just a tired, beat up discouraged Hadley sometime in round 3, but I'll be calling for the decision, same as you here. Third from the top at UFC Vegas 99 is a flyweight matchup between Charles Johnson and Mudaerji. Johnson, the 33-year-old St. Louis native fighting out of, or at least training out of Detroit, is 16-6 overall. He's 5-4 in the UFC, and he is on a 3-fight win streak. He suffered a 3-fight losing streak to close out last year. He is perfect this year so far with decision wins over Azat Maksum and Jake Hadley. And in his most recent appearance back in July, a 3rd-round knockout of Josh Van. Certainly the biggest win of his UFC run so far, and one that has him positioned as kind of a dark horse fringe contender in this division. He would love nothing better than to make it 4 in a row. In order to do so, he will need to get past Mudaerji. 28-year-old from China, the first Tibetan-born fighter in the UFC. He is also 16-6. He is 3-3 in the UFC. He is 2-1 since dropping to flyweight. He was already pretty good size as a bantamweight. He dropped to flyweight, and yeah, he is on a 2-fight losing streak, having been choked all the way to sleep by Matt Schnell and Tim Elliott in his last 2 appearances. You actually have to go back a little over 3 years for his last win. So this is a man desperately in need of some good news, some momentum. He is not favored to get it, as Johnson is -220, Mudaerji +180. Man, we just spent a few minutes talking about whether Jake Hadley is best suited for 125 or 135 pounds. And these are 2 guys that could set their drink on his head, to say nothing of like blocking his jump shot. I don't know if either of these guys is a future champ or this is the best flyweight fight of the month, but it's about the biggest flyweight fight that the UFC could make. These are 2 big dudes. I will come right out and say that I thought Charles Johnson was a sneaky, interesting prospect when the UFC signed him. Like they signed him on short notice to face Muhammad Mokaev. At the time, Mokaev and Tatsuro Taira were neck and neck for the hottest prospects in that division. And of the 2, Mokaev was almost certainly the one the UFC would rather have become a star, you know, as the kind of mouthy Dagestani by way of England. I mean, and even going into that fight, I thought, okay, Johnson will lose this one. He'll probably lose it bad, but I could see him sticking around and being a walking matchup problem for a couple of years. Like he's a good fighter. He actually had a pretty good showing against Mokaev, and since then, he's got some good wins under his belt. Yeah, he's, despite being, I'm gonna say he's probably the tallest flyweight in the UFC and probably has the greatest reach. I mean, he is the not even the John Jones. He's like the, you know, Ryan Spann or Kennedy Zechikwu of the men's flyweight division. He's pretty quick. He has 3 rounds worth of cardio, no problem. In fact, he has 3rd-round finishing ability, even in a fight that he may have been losing up to that point, like the Van fight. Like all the things that you would think would be liabilities for a 5'9" flyweight with like a 66-inch reach, he's been fine. His takedown defense is not the best, as will be the case if you're that tall and you're mostly legs, but he's not a guy that just slaps on a lousy guillotine, goes to his back, and just concedes the position for the next 3 minutes. He works hard to get back up. He works hard to make the fighter on top uncomfortable. And kind of like Laura Sanko said a year or 2 ago, and it stuck with me ever since, he tries to advertise the price of admission. You know, he understands on some level that if you're as tall and lanky as he is, the best takedown defense is discouraging people from even trying. So, you know, he's tries to meet people with intercepting knees or uppercuts against the fence. You know, he'll try the kind of elbows against the side of the head. Yeah, like Charles Johnson has turned into a pleasant surprise. I look at the upper reaches of the top 10 in the men's flyweight division, and it's hard for me to find wins for him there, but I could see him winning his way into the lower reaches of the top 10. And that's all gravy. This is a guy they brought in to get slaughtered by Muhammad Mokaev once upon a time. Yeah, good stuff from Charles Johnson. Always, always a bonus to have like a black dude with a mullet in the UFC. It's such a rarity. I'm just talking about Johnson because it's hard to come up with much to talk about Mudaerji. It hasn't worked yet on any level. When he got to the UFC, it was on the back of a lot of can crushing in WLF. Like WLF is just, I don't know, it's the Aspera FC of China. They will puff up some people's records, and the UFC signed him off a loss, and then he lost his UFC debut, and he just seemed like, and maybe this is an Enbo Fight Club thing, but Enbo Fight Club just seems to send Chinese fighters to the UFC that are big, strong, and fairly athletic, and just not very good at fighting. That sounds terrible, but I can't think of any other way to put it. Like Mudaerji, especially when he got to the UFC and he was like, 24, and this big dude, even for it just hasn't worked. And he's, tried dropping to 125, where he is way bigger than the people he's fighting, and people with any kind of ground game, that would be Matt Schnell and Tim Elliott, have put him all the way to sleep. I'm pretty sure he is the first and only UFC fighter ever to lose back-to-back fights by technical submission. I at least don't think that's what's going to happen this time. Here, I think Charles Johnson is probably going to march forward to his preferred range. I think he's going to be able to dictate the distance against Mudaerji. And Charles Johnson, Keith pointed this out, he does his best as an all the way out or all the way in fighter. Like if you want to stand at his long range, he'll just, jab and kick you, knowing that you probably can't reach him. Mudaerji is one of the few guys that might be able to, but if Mudaerji needs to come in at all to get into his preferred range, Johnson is the guy that will meet him there, initiate the clinch first, and not just let a shorter guy or, a barely shorter guy get in and start clocking him. I just don't see any place here where Mudaerji is going to be able to win rounds or really finish the fight outside of just catching Johnson with a huge shot. The one thing Mudaerji has is he's a hard hitter who does swing willingly. He's got good power, but I think it's going to take more than that to beat Johnson. I'm mildly surprised Johnson isn't a bigger favorite here. It's been a long time since Mudaerji won a fight, and Johnson's on a nice win streak here. Give me Johnson to win pretty much every minute of this thing on the way to, I'm going to say he knocks out Mudaerji in the third round. I could see him hurting him on the feet, following him to the ground and pounding him out there, but it should be all Charles Johnson all day here in my book.
You're talking about tall flyweights, but the first one that came to my mind that the UFC had back in the day, Whoop-Ass Willie Gates. I thought that would be a fun one to kind of compare those two.
Wow, that's a name I've not heard in a long, long time. And yeah, that's another person that was just built like a praying mantis. My goodness. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. This guy was skin and bones, but just he had that one badass knockout and then just washed out aside from that. But yeah. Anyway, I can't really disagree with anything that you've said. Mudaerji, he doesn't show up enough for me to really say that the 6 years that he's been in the UFC has been justified. Because I joked in the intro that he fights once a year, and if you look at his record, that really is what it is. He fought once in 18, 19, 20, which when you're at flyweight, you got a shorter shelf life than the other divisions. So fighting once a year is the worst thing that you can do in that division to be able to fast track yourself to success. So I don't know what the reason is or anything like that, but knowing that, it also makes me question just how seriously he wants to take his professional career. Which on the flip side, it's kind of funny. You take a look when Mudaerji debuted. I believe it was November 2018. Yep, November 2018. And he's got 6 fights under his belt. If you look at Charles Johnson, he debuted in July 2022, so just over 2 years. He's already got 9 fights under his belt. He is very much taking the Neil Magny approach towards getting better. Just get in there, get in the cage, get the experience, and learn. And Johnson has very much done that over the last little bit. He's typically been a slow starter as well. Takes a little bit to get cooking. And I think part of that is that he trusts his gas tank so well that he knows he's going to be there in the end. And he generally thinks that he'll be able to overwhelm at that point. And while that has generally been true, sometimes he's also dropped the first 2 rounds before he really gets cooking. So that has come back to bite him in the ass a couple of times. Problem is Mudaerji's not going to be able to wrestle him into the ground. I believe he scored 1 takedown throughout his UFC career. He's not a volume striker as well. He had a couple of fights where he did rack him up, but number one, he was the slugfest with Matt Schnell. Fun fight, but he got dragged into the type of fight that Schnell's going to win every time, provided he doesn't get knocked out. Schnell just outdogged him in that fight. And the other one was Andrei Sukumtov. And if anybody remembers Andrei Sukumtov, the guy was not very active. You could jab him up all day, just stay on the outside and jab him up. That's exactly what Mudaerji was able to do in that fight. But the other thing that kind of scares me with regards to Mudaerji is if you look at the people that he has beat, Sukumtov, Malcolm Gordon, and Zuruk Adashev. I don't try to be disrespectful to these fighters. They're doing something that I am completely unwilling to do myself. But none of these guys really had a long lasting, meaningful UFC career. Whereas Johnson, in 2 short years, I would say has already exceeded what any of those guys have been able to do. He's proven himself against tougher competition than Mudaerji. I very much agree with what you said. This should be a fight that Johnson's winning pretty much 95% of the time. I can see Mudaerji getting a heavy shot in there or two, maybe something that stumbles Johnson. But Johnson, up to this point, has also proven to be indestructible. He's lost some fights, but he hasn't been finished in any of these fights. He's there till the final bell. He's not going to give up, and I'm not going to say it's an impossibility that Mudaerji gets him out of there, but I think it's highly unlikely. So Johnson in a pretty one-sided decision for me as well.
That brings us to the co-main event of UFC Fight Night 245, a men's bantamweight matchup between Rob Font and Kyler Phillips. Font, the 37-year-old Massachusetts native, is 20-8 overall. He is 10-7 since joining the UFC as a standout in CES. He fought his way into the top 10, fought his way into, contention. There was a point where he may have been just 1 win away from a title shot, but he's fallen on hard times of late, and he comes into this matchup having lost 4 of his last 5. He's on a 2-fight losing streak, those being decision losses to Corey Sandhagen last August and Davison Figueiredo last December in Figueiredo's bantamweight debut. This will be his first cage appearance of 2024, and it will be against Phillips. The 29-year-old MMA lab product is 12-2 overall. He is 6-1 since joining the UFC as a veteran of the first season of Dana White's Contender Series, where he won, but was not immediately signed because it was season 1, and the UFC signed 1 fighter per episode instead of 5. At any rate, since being in the UFC, 6-1, and he is on a 3-fight win streak since his, frankly, very close majority decision loss to Raulian Paiva a little over 3 years ago. Since then, he has a submission defeat of Marcelo Rojo and decision wins over Hani Barcelos and Pedro Munoz. The most recent of those, the Munoz fight, was at UFC 299 back in March. So Phillips will look to make it 4 in a row, remind fans, media, UFC matchmakers that he is a rising force to be contended with here in the bantamweight division. He is heavily favored to get it done, probably to nobody's surprise. Phillips is minus 375, Font plus 275 as your underdog. And man, Rob Font used to be really awesome and a whole lot of fun to watch, and then he wasn't, and it's a bummer. And it really just seemed like it happened overnight. Like, he put together a 4-fight win streak, including being one of the guys to ruin, Cody Garbrandt's return. And since then, again, he's lost 4 or 5. And on the one hand, who's he lost to? Jose Aldo, Marlon Vera, Corey Sandhagen, Davison Figueiredo. Vera and Sandhagen were top 5 fighters at the time fought them. Aldo's an exception. He's his own case, but that is a rough matchup, especially for a guy that has to win fights on the feet like Font does. And then Figueiredo, we don't know yet, but he's already a top 10 bantamweight. And because he's Davison Figueiredo, he's never going to be more than a win or 2 away from a title shot. Like, Font, despite losing 4 of 5 fights, is just getting no breaks whatsoever from the UFC. If Keith were here, he would probably go on a mini rant at this point about how it may not be the best thing for Tyson Chartier to be these guys' coach and their manager. He's of the opinion that Tyson Chartier is a fantastic coach, that New England Cartel is easily the best gym in New England, but Chartier gets his people massacred either as short notice replacement opponents or just by, signing on the dotted line and throwing his better fighters in there against a murderer's row. I can't speak to that, but it does say something that Font, even at 37, even having lost 4 or 5, even potentially fighting for his job here, who knows, is getting someone like Kyler Phillips. That is rough, because Kyler Phillips is 6-1 in the UFC. And if you want to tell me that you think he should be 7-0, I am completely on board. At best, that lone loss to Hadley and Paiva maybe should have been a draw with a 10-8 round and then 2 10-9 rounds going the other way. Rough stuff for Font. When Font was at the height of his powers, obviously he was one of the more successful pure strikers in the division. And specifically, I thought top 4 or 5 best jab in the UFC at the time. There are fighters that don't throw the jab enough, and that's 85% of all MMA fighters don't throw the jab enough. Then there are fighters for whom the jab is a tool. It's a range finder. It's a rhythm disruptor. And then there are fighters for whom the jab is a weapon. And those are the guys that are splitting people's eyelids open, that are sitting people down and actually rocking them with jabs. And if you ask me who those types were in, say, 2020, 2021, it would have been Rob Font, Kamaru Usman, Israel Adesanya, and Rob Whittaker for that matter. Those type of guys. Font was beating people with pretty much just his jab. And when you think of, he's beating someone with just a jab, you think of miserable fights to watch, like late era Rory McDonald. But it was fun to watch when it was Font, because he was busting people the hell up with it. And even in the midst of his losing skid of late, he showed that's he blew up Adrian Yanez, who was one of the more promising up and coming strikers in the division. I know Font still has that on some level, but at 37, his not his window, but kind of the amount of slack he has to win fights that way is just getting smaller and smaller, to the point of disappearing, because he never had great takedown defense. But it was good enough a lot of the time when he could just keep people on the outside and just keep them so discombobulated by keeping that jab in their face. His lack of actual kill shot power didn't really hurt him too much, but these days, he's slowed just enough that people are hitting him more and hurting him more, and his ability to react to those shots is waning. He's never been great at checking leg kicks. That's cost him more recently. Well, especially going against 4 of the nastiest leg kickers in the whole division in Aldo, Vera Sandhagen, and Figueiredo. Just those are all things that make me think Phillips is going to be a rough matchup for him. Like Phillips is an explosive athlete with a karate influenced style that throws. I mean, he throws a certain amount of exotic stuff. He calls himself Matrix for a reason. He'll try, spinning stuff, kind of exotic looking kicks and stuff from a bladed stance, but he's also a good enough bread and butter kickboxer that he can just win rounds against other strikers. It's hard for me to see ways for Font to win this fight, which I guess explains him being a 4-1 underdog. Font, for as bad a defensive wrestler as he is, can be a surprisingly effective offensive wrestler, at least the times we've seen him try. I don't know if that'll work on Phillips. And if he tries to just sit there and jab and keep Phillips at Font's preferred range, I just don't think it's going to work. I think Phillips will start kicking his legs. Then when he starts reacting to the leg stuff, start kicking the body, go upstairs, start throwing, stepping in and throwing more hands on him. All of Font's losses up until now have felt kind of excusable. Like, yeah, he's lost 4 of his last 5, but he might still be the 8th best bantamweight in the world based on who he's lost to. I think this is one where, okay, yeah, he looks like he's old and on his way to shot. Give me Phillips I say it goes to decision. Font's incredibly tough, but there's just no question. And Phillips puts a serious whooping on him.
So when I first started looking at this fight, I took a lot of the same approaches that you did. It's like, oh yeah, wow, Font is shot. Phillips, fantastic athlete, has some surprising power. I say surprising because he hasn't been racking up the amount of knockouts that you would expect for somebody with the type of knockout power that he does have. But it's one of those deals where I feel like, telling people, no, trust me, it's there. And fantastic on the ground. He's at the same camp as O'Malley, and I feel like they kind of sharpen each other. I think that Phillips is great for O'Malley's ground game, and O'Malley is great for Phillips' striking. Given that he's not, we'll say, as out there as O'Malley is, he doesn't get nearly the amount of publicity. He isn't the chosen one of the UFC by any means, but there's absolutely no doubting his talent. So this does seem like a ready-made contest for him to be able to overthrow Font and continue his ascension up the bantamweight division. But I got to ask myself, okay, what is there a possibility that Font can win this? Because I feel like there's a little bit of a repeat here for Font with what happened with Adrian Yanez. Font had lost badly to Aldo, and then he lost badly to Vera, and then he was pit against another young up-and-comer in Yanez. And son of a bitch, if Font didn't just turn everybody on their head and school Yanez in that fight, finishing him in less than 3 minutes. So I kind of had to ask myself, is this another situation that Font could spring the upset and upend the Phillips train? Because, like you said, Font has one of the best jabs in the UFC, or in MMA in general, I should say. And Phillips has not faced somebody with the type of fundamental striking game that Font has. He's faced Ione Barcelos, who good, tight and explosive, but he also has a limited gas tank at this point. He's one of those who's battling father time. He won a striking battle with Pedro Munoz. Munoz is also one of the most compact bantamweights on the roster. if you can keep him on the outside, it's not too difficult to be able to deal with him. So I do think that there is an avenue of victory for Font there if he can get Phillips to just stand and trade. But and I know that I told you that I had limited time to do any sort of studying on this. Had my daughter's birthday party yesterday. Lots of fun with that. So didn't really have a lot of tape film.
How old?
Oh, she's only 3.
Whew.
Yeah.
Well, at 3, at least, they usually are looking forward to it. Like the first and second birthdays are for the parents and for
100%.
Yeah.
Let's correct that. That was for my wife. Oh God.
Yes.
Yeah. No, there was like 50 people over for the first party, and I'm like, oh God, get me out of here. My buddy found me standing next to the garbage can, and he laughed. He's like, yeah, I had to get out of there, huh? Yeah. But no, side note, we took her to a petting zoo. She got in there with the emus, all that fun stuff. And they even had a little mini roller coaster. And at 3 years old, I was shocked that she went on it the first time. And I'm thinking, and she's not going to want to do it again. But nope, she made her aunt take her immediately again. So good on her. Awesome. Anyway, back to the fight. The avenue to victory is there for Font. If he can get his jab going and crack Font, maybe rattle his cage a little bit. Rattle Phillips' cage a little bit. Anyway, because I think Phillips proved that his cage can't be rattled. You know, we were talking about the Paiva fight a little bit earlier, and Paiva didn't go away, and so that kind of rattled Phillips. Strong element, mental element when it comes to gassing as well. And it's possible that Phillips has learned from that, but if he gets cracked a time or two from Font, I can see Font gaining momentum and just writing him down. But the other thing, I was talking about film study. I didn't get much, but I did take a little bit. And damn it, if Phillips isn't a better wrestler than I remember, I think that he can get Font down, because Font is, you talked about his takedown defense being a major hole in his game. And if Phillips can just get 1 or 2 well-timed takedowns, I think that at this point, Font could kind of be playing with quicksand as well. Feel like, oh crap, here I am again. Because losing kind of snowballs. You lose one fight, you're like, okay, I'm all right. You lose a second, oh boy, can't let that happen again. A third fight, you start to panic. Now, he hasn't lost 3 consecutive yet, but he's lost 4 out of 5. It's hard for me to believe that that's not in the back of his mind, especially against somebody who has as much of an athletic advantage as Phillips, who in terms of pure athleticism, one of the best in the bantamweight division, bar none. So I very much agree with what you said. I do think there's a road for Font, but I don't think that Phillips will let him take it. I think Phillips probably learned a lot from the Paiva fight. And, as much as everybody likes to kind of joke about O'Malley not being the smartest fighter, he is an incredibly smart fighter. And a lot of that has to do with his camp. And I think Phillips is a big part of that. I think Phillips absorbs a lot of that as well. I think he's going to have a breakout performance and score a very clear. You know what? No, screw that. I'll say that he gets a submission. I think Font kind of breaks down towards the end, and we'll say he gets a late third round submission.
With that, we come to the main event of UFC Vegas 99, a 185-pound matchup between Anthony Hernandez and Michel Pereira. Hernandez, the 30-year-old from Northern California, is 12-2 with 1 no contest overall. He is 6-2 since joining the UFC as a veteran of season 2 of Dana White's Contender Series, where he got the win, but it was overturned for a positive drug test, and then also as the outgoing LFA middleweight champ. He is on a 5-fight win streak since getting knocked out in seconds by Kevin Holland like 4.5 years ago. He's already fought once this year. He tapped out Roman Kopylov at UFC 298 in February. So here he will look to make it 6 in a row. And in a division as wide open as middleweight, that's got to inch him into at least the outskirts of the title picture. But before he can do any of that, he will need to get past Michel Pereira, who is working on a similar streak of his own. 31-year-old Brazilian is 31-11 with 2 no contests overall. He is 9-2 in the UFC and on an 8-fight win streak overall, the last 3 of them at middleweight. As difficult as it is to believe when you look at this guy at the ceremonial weigh-ins on Friday, he did most of his work in the UFC so far at 170 pounds. It is ridiculous. But now he's at 185, and if anything, experiencing even more success as his 3 wins at middleweight are all by finish, all within the first round. He's fought twice this year already, choking out Michal Oleksiejczuk at UFC 299 in March, and then choking out Ihor Potieria at UFC 301 in May with the guillotine choke. So he'll look to make it 4 in a row in the division, 9 in a row in the UFC overall. He is not favored to do so, but the line is pretty tight. Hernandez is minus 145, Pereira plus 115. I said off the top that I love this matchup, and mostly it's just because I'm really intrigued by the people involved. Anthony Hernandez, again, I think he's super, if not underrated, just kind of unsung. And I can kind of understand why. Like in most divisions, you know, if somebody's on a 5-fight win streak with 4 finishes, even as they kind of creep up towards, you know, top 15 quality foes, you'd hear more about them. But Hernandez, by the eyeball test, I mean, he's a decent sized dude who looks to be in good shape, but he's not huge. He's not built like Michel Pereira or Gregory Rodriguez or Yoel Romero. He just 6'1" in shape guy. When you find out he's from like Northern California, you could picture him being like a Nick Diaz type who would rather be doing triathlons than fighting if he had the choice. Then, you know, he comes from you know, not one of the huge gyms. You know, MMA Gold Fight Team is famous probably most for Jim West yelling at Aspen Ladd between rounds a couple of years ago, but Hernandez is easily their best product at this point. But however he's done it, he's snuck in under the radar, and he's just a damn good fighter. He is a fantastic grappler, and it's MMA effective grappling. I mean, look no further than him being the guy that tapped out the black belt hunter a couple of years ago that actually started off this streak for him. Yeah, he's still just 30 years old, although I mean he'll be 31 by Saturday. Happy birthday in advance, Fluffy. I'm excited to see how far this guy can go. His striking is surprisingly serviceable for a guy that you definitely think of as a grappling specialist. He's a better athlete than you would think. He's physically stronger than you would think for a guy who, again, is not one of the huge diesel middleweights that populate the division. So on the one hand, you have the unsung, you know, maybe underrated Hernandez. On the other side, you have the biggest surprise, or one of the biggest surprises in the UFC over the last 5 years, in the form of Michel Pereira. When he came to the UFC, he already had like 8 losses. He was like something like 20-8, and his highlight reel was, it's hard to believe it was a real fighter. It looked like just some dude in Brazil trying to pull off pro wrestling spots that he saw on TV with his buddies in the garage. You know, we had a guy that, you know, would use like Anthony Pettis style Showtime punches where most fighters would use a jab. Like everything was backflips and flying guard passes, spinning everything, actual like capoeira style helicopter kicks. And he and Johnny Walker got to the UFC around the same time, and they felt kind of like welterweight and light heavyweight versions of a similar fighter, a fighter with incredible athleticism, incredible just size and physicality for the division, like perhaps like unparalleled size and physicality for the division, but with just such bizarre skill sets and such low fight IQ that they were never going to be more than a curiosity. And I thought that about Pereira, and when he lost 2 of his first fights in the UFC, both with just huge mental lapses, I felt vindicated. Like, yeah, he killed Danny Roberts in his debut, like he was supposed to. Then he lost a fight to Tristan Connolly, a converted lightweight, where he was absolutely putting it on him, and then just gassed out horribly and ended up losing. And from a guy that like breakdances his way to the cage and then breakdances in the cage until they call his name, of course he was going to gas out. Like, and then he was putting it on Diego Sanchez and got himself disqualified. Like, I think I could have been forgiven for saying, okay, Pineda will be fun while it lasts, but then all of a sudden he stopped losing fights. And while he's toned down the wild stuff a bit, he's still willing to throw it when he feels like it, but he's also capable of winning a straight ahead kickboxing match with a good welterweight striker without having to knock him out with a helicopter kick, as was evidenced by straight wins over Chaos Williams, Nico Price, Andre Fialho, all good strikers with good power, and he beat them all, making it to the final horn. So the gas problems, despite him being so huge and pushing such a work rate, he seemed to be fine. Then he decided to move up to 185 pounds. And if anything, that's just sort of unlocked a power up for him. I don't know if he's less concerned about his gas tank and so feels more comfortable just putting more oomph into his strikes. I don't know what it is, but one big part of it is that we found out pretty quickly in 2020, 2021 that Pereira is a much, much better wrestler than we had any reason to believe. And that's only carried over at 185 pounds, even though he's fighting bigger dudes. Like Michal Oleksiejczuk isn't big, but Andre Petrosky and Ihor Peteria both are. And like, it's wild just how overwhelmingly strong he is. Like, you can tell that he's somebody that probably didn't really start training wrestling, not even ahead of his MMA career, but probably didn't even really start training offensive wrestling until several years into his MMA career. And he's just taken to it like a fish to water because he is so athletic, so explosive, so strong. It reminds me a little bit of Jacare Souza, where despite not having a real wrestling background, he quickly identified the types of techniques that would work well with his athleticism, with his body, with his strength, and became a really outstanding wrestler. Pereira's doing the same, and it just so happens that the techniques that work well with his physicality include taking people's back standing and launching them with a suplex. I love it. Even though Pereira has shown abundantly now that he has 15 minutes of cardio if he needs it, we don't know yet whether he has 25 minutes of cardio, and we don't know if how well his cardio will hold up against someone as resilient as Hernandez. And that's what gives me pause in even thinking of calling for the mild upset from Pereira here. Just, I could see Pereira, I could see him lamping Hernandez in the first round, like Kevin Holland did. I assure you that Michel Pereira hits harder than Kevin Holland, and Holland knocked Hernandez out in like 30 seconds. I could see that happening. I could see Pereira suplexing Hernandez all over the cage for the first 2 rounds of the fight, or just kind of ragdolling him for a round like Rodolfo Vieira did. But Hernandez showed in the Vieira fight that he can do a great job of surviving and just making his opponent work. I think this is going to be a breakout performance for Hernandez. He's headlining an event now. It's a fight that should be really, really exciting, which top 15 matchups at 185 pounds aren't always, but this one should be bananas. But even if Hernandez is down 2 rounds to none at the end of the second, I still like him in this fight. He's a builder. I think, and I said this about Bilal Muhammad, I guess, probably 4 years ago, that he's just at the point in his career now where we may find out that all along, this is a guy built for 5-round fights. I think this is one of our first inklings of that when we see Hernandez maybe need to rally, but wins this fight going away against Pereira. I'm going to say it makes it to the final horn, but give me Hernandez in a 49, 46, 48, 47 type thing where he definitely wins the last 3 rounds and maybe one of the first 2, but should be a fantastic fight.
Yeah. It feels kind of like me just throwing out filler if I'm going to talk for too long about this fight. Because one of the phrases my former colleague at Bloody Elbow, Zane Simon, loves to throw out there is a 2 true outcome fight. And this one feels very much like that. Yeah. Either Pereira gets an early finish of the within this fight. And like you said, Hernandez chin is not made of iron. Like you said, Holland got him out of there early. So I'm a broken record right now, but if Holland can do it, Pereira can absolutely do it. But on the flip side, Hernandez has proven that he is as mentally tough as they come at this point. Because after that loss to Holland, he's just reeled off this win streak, and it hasn't been fluky either. He's gone into rough territory in some of these fights. He wasn't favored. And with the Rodolfo Vieira fight, Vieira, a highly renowned and touted BJJ practitioner, one of the best that the world has ever seen. And he ends up getting submitted by Hernandez. And at the time, people were laughing. Oh, yeah, Vieira ended up getting submitted by Fluffy. Nobody's laughing now because they look at Fluffy and they're like, oh, no, this guy's legit. And
Vieira is still winning fights. So it's not that he just exposed a bad fighter. He beat a good one. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, exactly. So at that point, while most of us saw it as a fluke, that just, oh, no, Vieira is not an actual fighter. No, it was the fact that Fluffy really is that damn good. We didn't see it yet. It took a few more fights before it really stuck within our craw. Because the funny thing is you could argue that within that 5-fight win streak, that the fight that kicked it off is probably the best win. I don't want to crap all over Roman Hopilov, but if we were to see Vieira and Hopilov fight, I'd probably pick Vieira in that fight. But Hernandez is the type of fighter who will drag you into deep waters. And he likes to be in those deep waters. And with Pereira, he's proven that he's got some dog in him. That was something that we all questioned early. Like you said, that loss to Connolly, everybody was laughing at, and then everybody was saying, okay, this guy's kind of a clown. He's going to wash out after he had that massive brain fart against Diego Sanchez. But to his credit, he's put everything together. He's proven that he's got dog in him. He's proven that he's got some brains in him, and he's put together an 8-fight win streak. We're talking about Fluffy's 5-fight win streak, but 8 wins. It may be over 2 divisions, but 8 wins is 8 wins, and he's got some good names upon there. At the same time, though, I fear that some of those names may not be quite what they were worth when he fought them. For example, Santiago Ponzinibbio, I hate to say it, but I think the Argentinian shot, and he probably was at the time Pereira fought him. Andre Fiallo, we thought we had something there with him, but he ended up washing out pretty quickly. Nico Price, again, another one of those guys that I think we didn't know it at the time, but he was on the shot end against Pereira. So there's reason to question the quality of Pereira's wins. That's not to say that he can't win this. Absolutely, I think he can. But I like the quality of opponent that Hernandez has been beating more than Pereira. I'll admit Pereira's has been more impressive, more aesthetically impressive, I should say. But I think there's a bit more substance to what Fluffy has been doing. He's consistently been breaking his opponents as opposed to catching them by surprise. And I really like the confidence that he's been displaying in his fights as well. He knows what he has to do. He knows that he's going to go through some fire, but in the end, provided he survives those flames, he knows that he's going to have his opponent dead to rights. And so I think it's going to be rough sledding in the first round. And again, Pereira very well could get him out of there. But I think if Hernandez can survive the first round, he will drag Pereira into deep waters. And I don't even think it'll go to decision. I think Pereira will be a broken man by the time he gets to the championship round. So I'll say Hernandez submission 4th round.
All right. And that is it. The Sherdog Radio Network preview for UFC Fight Night 245, Hernandez versus Pereira. I have been Ben. He has been Dayne. Thank you once again, Dayne, for filling in for Keith here so capably. We'll definitely have you back. Well, if your picks turn out all right. We'll see. I'm kidding. If this is your first time watching or listening to one of our previews, first of all, thank you. We hope you enjoyed it. Whether it is Keith in that chair or Dayne or it's me or someone else here, we do our best to bring you a mix of in-depth analysis and occasional historic or humorous asides that we think is pretty unique in this industry. Please do like, subscribe. Neither of those cost you a thing. They make our bosses happy and allow us to keep bringing you this content free of charge. Drop us a comment. I man the comment sections. I'd love to hear your take on these fights. If you think we're out of our gourds on any of these picks, let us know. If we missed any obvious upset potential, let us know. If you're right and we're wrong, we will give you all of your flowers on the recap. You just have to come join us. We're live on the Sherdog YouTube page right after the main event, talking about all 11 of these fights from the top to the bottom. We'll talk about what was good, what was bad, what was surprising, what was controversial. There's always something. Talking about what's next for some of the notable winners as well as losers, and talking with you because the live chat is open that whole time. So we're taking your questions, your comments, and your hot takes in real time. We have a growing community of friends that hang out with us after the fights. Dayne was one of them, even though he was already working in the industry at the time. I mean, he was a serious man at Bloody Elbow and still finding time to hang out with us. If he can do that, you have no excuse not to. We have a, like I say, growing community of friends that we hang out with after the fights, and we'd love for you to be part of it. Between now and then, thank you once again for listening. Enjoy the rest of your week, and by all means, enjoy these fights.
To the sea. Make your bed of fairy tales while you're hunting for your whale. So